So in your career, you got to match up against other Nike hoopers. Do you have a favorite matchup?
You're gonna get me in trouble. Honestly, I'll just say D, because she's such an icon in our sport and has been in the game for so long. You know, getting to share the court with her was pretty fun, and you just see her competitive spirit, even though you're not on her team. You can just...
Resources Nike puts behind Caitlin Clark now that we're going to start getting some of her merchandise coming out, and fans are indeed excited. I miss my GOAT playing. Gonna go ham on this commercial. I thought it was a nice commercial myself. Where is her own shoe? We're waiting on that. We are waiting on that. Wow. Y'all must have a fever or something. Oh, what a great double play on words. What a great double.
When Kate was hurt, and our offense was clicking, but now we have to have a new offense when she's in there because she just brings that much to the game. And so we have to adjust. And I think all of us just want it now. We know what the potential of this team can be, but we can't think about that. You really have to take day to day and stuff that worked here, we need to carry it over to tomorrow's game. We have a lot of games coming up in I think 7 days or whatnot, and so it's mentally making sure that we're good.
Commercial since she's entered the WNBA. I know she's made a cameo here, she's made a cameo there, she was featured as part of this rollout here, featured as part of this rollout there, but is this our first official Caitlin Clark solo commercial since she has joined the WNBA? And as well, WNBA ratings from this past week in non-Caitlin Clark games on NBA TV.
She walked into that Nike studio with zero fanfare. No press release, no warning, no cryptic Instagram post, just Caitlin Clark and one other person, not her agent, not her coach, not her parents. Everyone assumed it was a standard endorsement meeting, the kind athletes do dozens of times throughout their careers. Quick, transactional, professional. But what happened behind those closed doors that day would fundamentally shift how power moves work in professional women's sports. Within weeks, the WNBA would be reeling. Social media would explode. A'ja Wilson posted a single emoji that said everything. Angel Reese went live to her followers in disbelief. And inside the Fever locker room, silence turned into something unexpected, not anger, but a wave of motivation spreading through the entire team. This wasn't just about a shoe deal. This wasn't just about money, though the numbers were staggering. This was about loyalty. This was about what happens when a generational talent decides that climbing to the top alone isn't worth it. This was the moment the WNBA changed forever. And it all started with a single golden box. When Caitlin Clark first entered the Nike headquarters, the whispers had already started circulating through the league. Everyone knew something big was coming. Her rookie season had shattered expectations that even the most optimistic analysts had set. She'd filled arenas that NBA teams couldn't pack. She'd drawn national television ratings that executives hadn't seen in years. The merchandise was flying off shelves before it even officially launched. Nike wasn't just interested in Clark, they were obsessed. But what nobody anticipated was how she'd handle that power once she had it. The meeting wasn't scheduled like typical endorsement negotiations. There were no competing bids from other brands. There was no public courtship where various companies tried to win her signature. Instead, Nike executives received a call. Caitlin wanted to talk, she wanted to talk privately, and she wanted to bring exactly one person with her, Sophie Cunningham. That detail alone sent shockwaves through anyone paying attention. Sophie wasn't her best friend from high school. Sophie wasn't her agent or manager. Sophie wasn't even her closest teammate on the Indiana Fever. Sophie was a veteran, a grinder, someone who'd been quietly doing the work in the WNBA for years without the spotlight, or the endorsement deals, or the national television appearances. Why would Caitlin bring her to what everyone assumed would be a solo negotiation? The answer to that question would become the entire story. Inside that studio, with cameras ready and lighting set up for what Nike believed would be a straightforward signature shoot, Caitlin made a request that caught the executives off guard. She didn't want a solo deal. Or rather, she wanted one, but not in the way they'd planned it. She wanted something that had never been done before in professional basketball, male or female. She wanted her signature shoe to carry two names. Nike hesitated. This wasn't how the business worked. Signature shoes belonged to one athlete. That athlete's name, their image, their personal brand, that's what sold the product. Having two names on the tongue of a shoe diluted the message. It confused the consumer. It created complications with marketing, with royalties, with everything that made the endorsement machine run smoothly. The executives explained this to Clark. They were respectful but firm. This isn't how signature transactions work. But Caitlin had already made up her mind before she walked in. She looked at Nike's decision-makers directly and told them something that would later be repeated across every sports media outlet, every basketball podcast, every locker room conversation for months to come. "I didn't get here alone," she said, "and I won't stay here alone." Those 8 words changed everything. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't demanding in a way that felt entitled. It was simply the truth, delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that had made her dangerous on the basketball court. Sophie sat beside her during this conversation. She hadn't expected this. None of the other players in the league had expected this. In an industry where personal branding is everything, where athletes spend years building their individual image and their individual market value, Caitlin was voluntarily sharing her platform with someone else. She was taking what would likely be a 9-figure deal and insisting that it be split, not necessarily financially, but symbolically, with someone who'd been fighting in the trenches while others were just arriving. The Nike executives looked at each other. This was unprecedented. This was also, they realized within minutes, potentially brilliant. If Caitlin Clark was willing to do this, if she was willing to share her moment, then that story became even bigger than a simple endorsement. It became a statement about character. It became something that transcended sneakers and became about values. They said yes. What happened next was carefully orchestrated but still felt genuine, which is perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire situation. Caitlin and Sophie returned to that Nike studio days later. The lighting was perfect. The cameras were rolling. And when Caitlin opened that golden box, the one that contained the prototype shoe with white and gold detailing and both of their initials embroidered on the tongue, her reaction wasn't manufactured. When she turned to Sophie and simply said, "This is ours," there was a moment of pure human connection happening on film that no marketing team could have created artificially. The shoe itself became an artifact. It wasn't just footwear. It was a physical representation of a philosophy that Caitlin Clark was introducing to professional basketball at the highest level. You could wear it. You could collect it. You could stand in line at a store to buy it. And every single time someone laced up those sneakers, they were participating in a larger conversation about what it means to succeed with integrity, to lift others as you rise, to remember the people who defended you when defending you wasn't the popular choice. That golden box, that shoe, that moment, it was the beginning of something that would reshape how people thought about power, loyalty, and legacy in professional sports. To understand why Nike executives didn't take months deliberating this deal, why they didn't call in legal teams and brand strategists to debate the wisdom of Caitlin's proposal, you have to understand what she'd already accomplished by that point. You have to understand the specific moment in basketball history where this negotiation was taking place. When Caitlin Clark was drafted by the Indiana Fever, there were skeptics. There were always skeptics when it came to women's basketball. The narrative was predictable: smaller market, lower viewership, less athleticism, less drama. It was the same tired script that had played out for decades. Media outlets treated women's basketball like it was a charitable cause to promote rather than a product worth investing in. Sponsorships were scarce. Television ratings were modest. The general public didn't tune in unless there was a massive college tournament moment or a once-in-a-generation player. Then Caitlin Clark happened. Her first game, people watched. Her second game, more people watched. By her 10th game, arenas were being packed in cities where Wnba attendance had been a chronic problem for years. In some cases, the Fever were outdrawing the local NBA franchise. Let that sink in. A rookie in a league that had been perpetually undervalued was literally filling seats better than established professional basketball franchises with decades of history. The numbers became impossible to ignore. When she dropped 40 points on national television, it wasn't just a statistical accomplishment. It was a cultural moment. Sports channels replayed the highlights endlessly. Social media wasn't just talking about the performance, it was experiencing a genuine shock that women's basketball could look like this, could feel like this, could matter like this. The question shifted from, are people interested in women's basketball? 2. Why haven't we been paying attention to this the entire time? Nike had been watching closely. They'd always had a presence in women's basketball, but Clark represented something different. She represented proof that the market was finally ready to explode. Every metric pointed upward. Merchandise sales were breaking records. Television viewership was climbing every week. Corporate sponsors who'd been skeptical about women's sports were suddenly asking how they could get involved. The cultural moment had arrived, and Caitlin Clark was the catalyst. The company had already approved a massive contract to make her the face of a new women's basketball initiative. This wasn't a small deal. This was a fundamental commitment to building an entire ecosystem around her presence in the league. They were planning signature shoes, exclusive apparel lines, premium endorsement packages. The investment was substantial because the data suggested the return would be equally substantial. But here's where it gets interesting. Nike knew something else about Caitlin Clark beyond the statistics and the highlight reels. They knew about her character. They'd been studying not just her performance on the court, but how she carried herself off it. They'd seen how she treated veterans who were initially skeptical of her arrival. They'd noticed how she handled the inevitable rookie hazing that comes with entering a professional league dominated by experienced players who sometimes resent the attention given to newcomers. When reports started surfacing about Sophie Cunningham defending Caitlin during games when tensions ran high, when word spread through the basketball community that Sophie had taken a fine to back up the rookie, Nike's marketing teams took note. These weren't just random acts of teamwork. This was a story about loyalty, about standing up for someone when it's not the easy choice, about a veteran choosing solidarity over resentment. That's the story Nike wanted to tell. Not just Caitlin Clark is an incredible player, but Caitlin Clark is an incredible person who recognizes and honors the people who support her. That narrative is more valuable than any individual achievement because it speaks to something deeper in human psychology. It speaks to values that transcend sports. When Caitlin walked into that meeting and proposed sharing the spotlight, Nike executives realized she was handing them the perfect story. They weren't losing anything by agreeing. They were actually gaining leverage. Instead of promoting a signature shoe as a symbol of individual achievement, they could promote it as a symbol of something far more powerful. A young superstar who understood that real success is built on community, not isolation. The speed of the decision made sense when you understood the calculation. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a basketball player with impressive stats. She was a player with impressive stats who also happened to embody values that resonated with consumers. She was someone who could sell shoes, yes, but she could also sell a philosophy. She could inspire people not just to buy products, but to think differently about what it means to be excellent. Nike moved fast because they recognized they were in the presence of something rare in professional sports, an athlete with both extraordinary talent and extraordinary character, ready to leverage that combination in a way that had never been attempted before. The $1 billion investment wasn't just about basketball. It was about betting on the future of how professional athletes use their power. Before we dive deeper into what Caitlin actually proposed, it's important to understand why this was so shocking within the context of professional sports history. Signature shoes represent one of the most important assets an athlete can build. They're not just endorsement deals, they're legacy products. They're the physical manifestation of an athlete's personal brand. When Michael Jordan's shoes carry only his name, that's intentional. When LeBron James' signature line features only his initials, that's strategic. The entire endorsement industry is built on the principle that these products belong to one person, one image, one brand. Diluting that by adding another name seems like business suicide from a corporate perspective. Why would you share revenue? Why would you confuse the marketing message? Why would you give another athlete claim to what's ostensibly your achievement? This is what made Caitlin's proposal so radical. She didn't arrive at the Nike studio with a formal presentation or PowerPoint slides. She didn't come prepared with market research or consumer studies backing up her idea. Instead, she came with a simple conviction. She came with an understanding that Sophie Cunningham had sacrificed for her in ways that most rookie athletes never experience. She came with the knowledge that loyalty, real loyalty, deserves recognition beyond private gratitude. The conversation, from what's been reported, went something like this. Caitlyn told Nike that she wanted her signature shoe to exist. Absolutely. That was non-negotiable. She was going to be the primary face of the campaign. Her name would be the primary name. But she also wanted Sophie's initials embroidered on the tongue. She wanted the marketing materials to tell the story of two players, not one. She wanted to use her platform to elevate someone who'd been grinding in the league without the same recognition. When Nike executives explained that this wasn't how signature shoes typically worked, that it might dilute the brand value, that it created complications with manufacturing and marketing and distribution, Caitlyn listened carefully. Then she doubled down. She explained that this was non-negotiable for her. If Nike wanted her as the face of this campaign, if they wanted her to be the centerpiece of their women's basketball initiative, then they were going to have to accept this condition. It was a power move, but not in the aggressive way power moves are typically executed. Caitlyn didn't threaten to take her business elsewhere. She didn't present it as a demand backed by ego. She presented it as a reflection of her values, and she made it clear that those values weren't separate from her basketball ability. They were connected. They defined who she was as a person and as a player. What happened next is where the story becomes genuinely interesting from a business perspective. Instead of rejecting the proposal, Nike's team started seeing the strategic opportunity. They began asking questions. What if this wasn't a dilution of the brand but an expansion of it? What if, instead of fighting against Caitlyn's vision, they embraced it and made it central to the entire campaign? The executives started brainstorming. What if they created an entirely new concept around this idea? What if the signature shoe wasn't just a one-time collaboration, but the beginning of an annual tradition? What if, every year, Caitlyn Clark could highlight a different Wnba player through a special edition release? What if this became the defining characteristic of her partnership with Nike? Not just her scoring ability or her court vision, but her willingness to use her platform to recognize excellence in others. That conversation led to what would eventually become known as the legacy line. This wasn't just a shoe. This was a framework for how Caitlyn was going to operate within her endorsement deal. Every year, there would be a special release featuring two names. Every year, there would be a new story about a player who'd earned recognition. Every year, there would be another athlete lifted into the spotlight alongside Caitlyn. From a marketing perspective, this was genius. It created annual buzz. It created narrative momentum. It created a reason for fans to stay invested not just in Caitlyn Clark's season, but in the larger Wnba ecosystem. Every release would tell a story. Every shoe would represent a value system, not just a player. But here's what's crucial to understand. None of this would have happened if Caitlyn hadn't been willing to challenge the conventional wisdom about how endorsement deals work. None of this would have happened if she'd accepted the Nike executive's initial explanation that signature shoes are supposed to be solo ventures. Instead, she looked at the situation and asked a different question. Not, how do I maximize my individual endorsement value? But, how do I use this platform to reshape how the Wnba recognizes and celebrates its players? The shoe itself became secondary to the philosophy behind it. The white and gold design was beautiful, sure. The quality would be exceptional, naturally. But the real product Nike was selling was the idea that excellence in sports doesn't have to be an individual achievement. It can be a collective expression of values. It can be a partnership. It can be about lifting others as you rise. That's why Nike moved so fast. That's why they broke their own rules. That's why they saw this not as a complication, but as an opportunity. Caitlyn Clark had just handed them the template for how to market women's basketball in a way that felt authentic, meaningful, and genuinely revolutionary. To truly understand why Caitlyn insisted on sharing this moment with Sophie Cunningham, you need to understand who Sophie is and what she'd already endured in a league that doesn't always reward quiet excellence or behind-the-scenes hustle. Sophie Cunningham entered the Wnba with expectations that were, by the standards of women's basketball, moderate. She was skilled, athletic, intelligent on the court, but she didn't come in as a transcendent prospect. She didn't have the national profile or the media hype machine working overtime to build her brand. She was, in many ways, a player who had to earn respect through consistent performance rather than being given it as a birthright. For years, she did exactly that. She showed up. She worked. She became a reliable defender, a player other coaches trusted, someone who understood the nuances of professional basketball in ways that only come through experience and dedication. She wasn't putting up 30 points a night. She wasn't breaking single-game records or filling highlight reels with impossible shots, but she was essential. She was the kind of player that every championship team needs, even if she never makes the all-star team. Then Caitlin Clark arrived. The dynamic in the WNBA shifted almost overnight. Suddenly, there was a newcomer commanding attention, breaking records, drawing crowds, appearing in national commercials before some veterans had ever done a single endorsement deal. For some veteran players, this was exciting, a sign that the league was finally getting the investment and attention it deserved. For others, it was more complicated. For some, it felt like a slight, like all the work they'd put in for years was being overshadowed by one incredibly talented rookie. Tensions rose. There were moments on the court where veteran players tested Caitlin, challenged her, made it clear that just because she was talented didn't mean she could waltz into their league without earning her stripes. This is a normal part of professional sports. Rookies have to prove themselves. They have to earn respect from the people who have been doing this longer. But Sophie chose a different path. Instead of joining other veterans in making Caitlin's rookie year harder, Sophie decided to have her back. And here's what's important. She did this when it would have been easier not to. She did this when being on the wrong side of the media narrative would have been beneficial. She did this when other players were getting attention specifically for challenging or criticizing the rookie phenom. There are documented instances of Sophie standing up for Caitlin during games when things got heated. There are reports of her defending the rookie in the locker room when other veterans were venting frustration about attention and endorsement deals. When tensions flared and situations could have escalated, Sophie was the steady presence that reminded everyone that Caitlin was her teammate, not her rival. At one point, Sophie apparently took a fine, a financial penalty from the league, for defending Caitlin on the court. Think about that for a moment. She literally paid money out of her own pocket to stand up for someone who was, in some ways, taking opportunities that could have gone to other players. That's not a decision you make lightly. That's not a decision you make unless you genuinely believe in someone and their character. Years in the WNBA had taught Sophie something valuable about basketball that statistics don't capture. She understood that a rising tide lifts all boats. She understood that if Caitlin Clark's presence in the league was going to grow women's basketball, then eventually that growth would benefit everyone, including players like her who'd been grinding quietly for years. Instead of being threatened by Caitlin's arrival, Sophie saw an opportunity to be part of something bigger. That perspective is rare in professional sports. It's the kind of perspective that separates truly great teammates from good players. Sophie chose solidarity over resentment. She chose growth over jealousy. She chose to use whatever influence and respect she'd built over years in the league to help a rookie who was getting unfairly tested by some of her new peers. Caitlin remembered this. She didn't forget the moments when Sophie backed her up. She didn't forget the fine. She didn't forget the conversations in the locker room. She didn't forget that when the spotlight was on her and everything was exciting and new, there was one veteran player who treated her like a teammate first and a competition second. That's why the Golden Box existed. That's why Sophie was in that Nike studio. That's why Caitlin was willing to share her signature shoe with someone else. It wasn't a marketing decision, though it turned out to be a brilliant one. It was a personal decision rooted in genuine gratitude and respect. Sophie's story is the story of thousands of professional athletes who work tirelessly without the fanfare, who do the work because they love the game, who support teammates even when it's not convenient or profitable. Sophie represents the backbone of professional sports, the players who make sure that winning teams actually function. The players who understand that championships are built on relationships, not just talent. By insisting on sharing this moment with Sophie, Caitlin was saying something profound to the entire WNBA. She was saying that these quiet, consistent contributors matter. She was saying that loyalty deserves recognition. She was saying that the narrative of women's basketball shouldn't only center on the brightest stars, but should include the people who make those stars better. The day of the actual shoot was meticulously planned. Nike had coordinated everything down to the smallest detail. The lighting was perfect. The camera angles had been tested multiple times. The makeup team was standing by. The photographers were briefed. The videographers had their shots planned. Everything was designed to capture what Nike believed would be a simple, straightforward moment. A young superstar opening a box containing her signature shoe and smiling for the camera. What nobody anticipated was that the moment would actually be emotional. When Caitlin walked into that studio on the day of the shoot, she knew what was coming. She'd helped design the shoe. She'd approved the gold detailing, the white leather, the way Sophie's initials had been embroidered on the tongue. But seeing it for the first time, physically in front of her, in that golden box, still hit differently than she expected. The cameras started rolling. The photographers were ready. And then, as Caitlin opened that box, something shifted. This wasn't a corporate endorsement moment. This was a personal moment being captured on film. This was a rookie in her first season deciding to share her historic moment with someone who'd believed in her. She turned to Sophie, and in that moment of pure authenticity that no director could have orchestrated, Caitlin simply said, "This is ours. Not this is yours or I wanted to give you this. But this is ours." Signifying partnership. Signifying shared ownership. Signifying that what was about to happen, the sales, the cultural impact, the legacy, was something they were building together. Sophie's reaction was genuine. This wasn't an actress pretending to be surprised. This was a veteran player, someone who'd been in the league for years without this kind of recognition, experiencing a moment of validation that transcended basketball. Within seconds, what had been orchestrated as a simple brand moment became something that would circulate through social media, through locker rooms, through conversations about what women's basketball could be. The footage leaked within hours, not because Nike wanted it leaked, though the publicity certainly helped their cause, but because someone in the studio that day understood that what they'd just witnessed was historically significant and that people needed to see it. Within hours, the moment had been clipped, edited, uploaded, and was spreading across every basketball community online. Social media erupted, but not in the way traditional endorsement moments typically do. This wasn't just people going, "Cool shoe, I want to buy it." This was people having visceral reactions to what Caitlin had done. Wnba Wilson, one of the league's biggest stars, posted a single emoji, a crown. That's all she needed to say. Everyone understood the message. The crown belonged to Caitlin Clark, but she was making sure everyone knew it wasn't hers alone. Angel Reese, another prominent player, went live on social media in what seemed like a moment of genuine reaction. She was talking about what the gesture meant, what it signified for how the next generation of women's basketball players might operate. It wasn't a post-planned marketing moment. It was a real person, responding in real time to something that moved her. Inside the Fever locker room, something unexpected happened. There was silence at first, the kind of silence that comes when everyone is processing information that challenges their assumptions about how sports work, how endorsements work, how power typically gets wielded. Then, gradually, that silence transformed. Players started talking about what this meant. They started realizing that Caitlin had just sent a message to the entire league. The message wasn't subtle. It was a direct challenge to conventional thinking about how professional athletes handle success. It was a statement that reaching the top doesn't require crushing everyone beneath you. It was a demonstration that you can be enormously successful while simultaneously lifting others. What happened in that locker room wasn't jealousy or resentment. It was motivation. It was players looking at Caitlin and thinking about who they'd want to recognize when their time came. It was a domino effect of inspiration. If Caitlin Clark, the most hyped rookie in years, could share her moment, then what did that say about what other players could do? The shoe itself sold out in minutes. Not hours, minutes. Nike's inventory management team, despite predicting high demand, hadn't anticipated exactly how fast the product would move. It became a collectible immediately. People weren't just buying a shoe to wear. They were buying a piece of sports history. They were buying a physical representation of a philosophy about loyalty and shared success. On resale markets, the price skyrocketed. The Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham collaborative sneaker became one of the most sought-after basketball shoes in recent memory, not because of performance features or aesthetic appeal alone, but because of the story it represented. Every person buying that shoe was voting with their money for what Caitlin had done. But the most important reaction happened in places the cameras couldn't capture. It happened in conversations between players about loyalty. It happened in casual discussions between young athletes about what kind of leaders they wanted to become. It happened in locker rooms across the league, where players were thinking differently about their responsibilities to each other. The golden box wasn't just a marketing prop. It was a catalyst. It was the moment that officially signaled that something had shifted in how professional women's basketball operated. Once the moment went viral, once the social media dust settled, and everyone had processed what Caitlin Clark had actually done, Nike and the Wnba were left with a very interesting situation. They had just witnessed something genuinely unprecedented in professional sports, and now they had to figure out what to do with it. Behind the scenes at Nike headquarters, the conversations shifted dramatically. The executives who'd initially hesitated about Caitlin's proposal were now looking at the data and seeing something remarkable. The shoe had sold out instantly. The story was being covered not just by sports media, but by mainstream outlets. Caitlin's favorability ratings had actually increased. Sophie's profile had been elevated significantly, and the broader narrative around women's basketball had shifted in ways that typically take years to accomplish. The company realized they were sitting on something far more valuable than a standard signature shoe deal. They were sitting on a template. They were sitting on proof that this model, where a star athlete uses their platform to elevate others, resonated with consumers on a fundamental level. It made people want to participate. It made the product feel like it was part of something meaningful, rather than just a commercial transaction. That's when Nike officially approved what would become known as the Legacy line. This wasn't a minor addition to Caitlin's existing deal. This was a fundamental restructuring of how her endorsement partnership would work. Going forward, every year, there would be a special edition signature release. Every year, Caitlin would select a different player who she believed had earned recognition. Every year, that player's name or initials would be featured on the shoe, the marketing materials, the entire campaign. Every year, there would be a new story about loyalty, about excellence, about the Wnba recognizing its contributors. From a business perspective, this was brilliant strategy. It created an annual event. It created ongoing narrative momentum. It kept Caitlin Clark's brand relevant and evolving rather than static. It also ensured that the broader Wnba community felt invested in her success. Other players wouldn't be resenting Caitlin's dominance because she was actively using her platform to shine a light on them. But there was something else happening behind the scenes that was equally important. Nike was beginning to see women's basketball not as a charity case or a secondary market, but as the future of sports marketing. They started increasing their investment significantly. They began planning more signature lines, more exclusive partnerships, more resources directed toward developing women's basketball talent. Caitlin had essentially forced Nike to accelerate a timeline that they'd already been considering, but hadn't fully committed to. By insisting on sharing her platform, she demonstrated that there was authentic demand for meaningful storytelling around women's athletes. She'd shown that consumers would respond to narratives that transcended individual achievement. The league itself started paying attention. The Wnba had been experiencing growth, sure, but the growth had been gradual, almost apologetic in tone, like the league was grateful for whatever attention it could get. Caitlin's moment changed that dynamic. It signaled to the entire sports world that women's basketball wasn't asking for a seat at the table anymore. It was demanding one, and it was prepared to do so with excellence and character. Within weeks of the golden box moment, we started seeing other players making bigger sponsorship announcements. The Arby's deal with Sophie Cunningham that's mentioned in the original title, that wasn't a coincidence. Brands suddenly wanted to be associated with women's basketball. They wanted to be part of the cultural conversation that Caitlin had started. Behind the scenes at the Fever, the organization was dealing with a different kind of situation. They were managing a locker room that had fundamentally shifted its culture. Players were feeling more united, more motivated, more part of something significant than they might have otherwise felt. Caitlyn's gesture had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the endorsement deal itself. Coaches and front office personnel noticed something that wouldn't show up in statistics but was clearly visible in practice. The team was more cohesive. Veterans who might have otherwise been distant from the rookie were now engaging with her as a genuine peer. The locker room banter was different. The energy was different. Caitlyn had essentially used her endorsement moment to revolutionize her team's culture. The media landscape shifted as well. Sports journalists who'd been covering women's basketball with a certain amount of condescension or surprise, like they were reporting on something unexpected, suddenly started treating it as a major story with legitimate cultural significance. The narrative changed from, "Isn't it impressive that women's basketball is growing?" to "This is an essential part of how professional sports are evolving." Behind the scenes, there were also conversations about what other young stars might do with similar platforms. Caitlyn had essentially set a new standard. Future athletes would be asked, "Are you going to do something similar? Are you going to use your endorsements to help elevate your community?" The question was no longer optional. Nike also started developing the infrastructure to support the legacy line long-term. They assigned specific teams to work on the annual selections, the storytelling, the marketing campaigns that would accompany each release. What had started as a modification to Caitlyn's deal became an entire department's focus. The most significant change, though, was more subtle. It was a shift in how power worked in professional women's basketball. Caitlyn Clark had demonstrated that real power, the kind that lasts, that resonates, that creates lasting change, comes from lifting others, not from dominating them. That understanding would influence how the next generation of women's athletes approach their careers and their platforms. When the full context of what Caitlyn had done became clear to the Fever locker room, the reactions were immediate and visceral. This wasn't a moment that required time to process or debate to understand. Players got it instantly. They understood what Caitlyn had chosen to do and what it meant. For some veterans, particularly those who'd been quietly skeptical of the rookie sensation, the moment was revelatory. It reframed how they understood Caitlyn as a person and as a teammate. She wasn't just talented. She wasn't just generating numbers and attention. She was genuinely aware of who had supported her, and she was using her power to acknowledge that support in a way that would benefit the entire team, the entire league. That understanding spread through the locker room like a current. Players who hadn't been particularly close to Caitlyn started engaging with her differently. The implicit tensions that exist in any locker room with a dominant rookie, the unspoken competition for attention, for opportunities, for recognition, started to dissolve. Because Caitlyn had just demonstrated that recognition wasn't a zero-sum game. There was enough space for multiple people to be recognized, to be celebrated, to have their contributions valued. Sophie, in particular, experienced something that few athletes ever get to experience. She went from being a solid veteran doing her job to becoming part of a historically significant moment. She wasn't just getting a shoe deal or an endorsement opportunity. She was being publicly recognized by one of the biggest stars in the league as essential to that star's success. That kind of validation, that kind of public acknowledgement, is something that carries weight far beyond the immediate commercial value. Inside the locker room, Sophie's presence took on new significance. She wasn't just another player on the roster. She was the person Caitlyn had chosen to honor. That distinction created a subtle shift in team dynamics. Sophie became more central to conversations about culture and values. She became someone younger players looked to as an example of the kind of teammate worth emulating. What happened next in the locker room was perhaps the most important part of this entire story. Instead of the typical dynamic where a star player becomes increasingly isolated as their individual success grows, the opposite occurred. Caitlyn's gesture created an opening for deeper team connection. Players started asking themselves the same question: who has had my back? Who deserves recognition? That question is the foundation of team chemistry. That question is what separates good teams from great teams. Caitlyn hadn't just made a commercial decision. She'd essentially initiated a conversation about gratitude and loyalty that would reshape how her team operated. The reactions from other WNBA players also started to filter back into the Fever locker room. When Aja Wilson posted that crown emoji, that wasn't just a social media moment. That was one of the league's biggest stars publicly validating what Caitlin had done. When other veterans started commenting, started sharing their own experiences with teammates who'd supported them, started processing their feelings about what this moment meant for the league, the Fever players were seeing it all. There was this interesting dynamic that developed. Players started feeling like they were part of something bigger than their individual careers. They started understanding that Caitlin's decision wasn't just about Nike and endorsements. It was a philosophical statement about how the WNBA was going to operate going forward. Some players, privately, started thinking about their own futures. If they ever got to Caitlin's level of success, how would they handle it? Would they remember the people who'd supported them? Would they use their platforms to elevate others? That internal question, once posed, doesn't go away. Caitlin had essentially set a new cultural standard for how ambitious athletes should behave. Inside the locker room, there were also more practical effects. The team's defensive intensity improved. The spacing on a fence got tighter. The communication became crisper. It's impossible to directly attribute these improvements to one endorsement decision, but there's a psychological component to culture that's undeniable. When a team believes in its leadership, when players feel genuinely valued and recognized by their star, performance increases. Coaches started noticing something interesting as well. The usual rookie hazing or skepticism that sometimes affects young players entering established teams was essentially neutralized. Because Caitlin had publicly acknowledged her need for veterans, because she'd made Sophie's contributions central to her own narrative, other veterans felt less inclined to challenge her. Instead, there was a natural hierarchy based on respect rather than competition. The media started reporting on these locker room dynamics. What had started as a story about an endorsement deal evolved into a story about team chemistry. Analysts started crediting Caitlin's leadership for improvements in the Fever's play. Some of that was surely her on-court performance, but some of it was undoubtedly the cultural shift that came from how she'd handled her initial success. Perhaps most importantly, younger players on the team, those further down the roster, those without major endorsements, those still trying to establish themselves, started seeing Caitlin differently. She wasn't just talented. She was someone who understood that building something lasting required recognizing everyone's contributions. That understanding filtered down through the entire organization. What happened in that Fever locker room was a microcosm of what was happening across the entire WNBA. One gesture had shifted how players thought about success, about loyalty, about using their platforms. The golden box moment wasn't just commercial. It was cultural. It was changing the implicit rules about how power was supposed to work in professional women's basketball. This is where we are now. Not at the end of a story, but at the beginning of something that's going to reshape professional women's basketball for years to come. Caitlin Clark's decision to share her signature moment with Sophie Cunningham wasn't just a single gesture. It was a statement about values that echoes far beyond one endorsement deal or one shoe release. The WNBA is entering a new era where individual achievement means something only when it's connected to community impact, where endorsements are evaluated not just by the numbers they generate, but by the culture they create, where loyalty, gratitude, and recognition aren't weakness or distraction. They're the foundation of genuine greatness. Other players are watching, other brands are watching. The next generation of young athletes is watching and understanding that the way to build something that lasts isn't through dominance, but through elevation, through lifting others, through using power responsibly, through understanding that a rising tide really does lift all boats. The golden box is just the beginning. The legacy line is just the framework. What matters is what comes next, how Caitlin's example influences everyone else in the league, how it changes what fans expect from their heroes, how it demonstrates that women's basketball isn't just growing in numbers, but in character. That's the real story. That's what will define this moment in the history of sports.